Then you have to clean it up to get out the non-compostable stuff that people didn't do a good job of separating out. Usually it's plastic shards of one sort or another. And then you have the nice flat finished compost. Next. And then you can close the recycling loop by reusing that for a good purpose. Most of the compost that's made from our organics is used by commercial landscapers and by transportation departments to revegetate the sides of roads after they're reconstructed. And that's what's going on here. They're blowing on a 2-inch blanket that has seed already in it. It's really fantastic for preventing soil erosion before the site revegetates, and then it revegetates quicker. This was a pilot project that we did in Eden Prairie a couple of years ago, trying to get our county transportation department to get comfortable using compost. These are called compost blankets on their projects, because we want to do the full loop, everything from setting up the diversion programs to increasing the markets to use this stuff. Because if we don't have markets on the back end, then we're just going to have giant piles of compost sitting out there and no one's going to use them. And it's great to sell it 50-pound bags at a time at Menards or wherever, but it's a whole lot better to use the 300 cubic yards that we use on this site. You use up a whole lot more. Next, please. There's a lot of benefits to organics composting. That valuable compost, it replenishes soils. I just talked about reducing soil erosion. You can also use it to prevent polluted stormwater runoff from getting to water bodies. You can make things that are called compost socks. They look like big mesh tubes, and there's compost inside that actually will filter and capture the pollutants before they get into a water body. You can put them around storm drains, put them around construction sites instead of the silt fencing. They work a lot better, and then you can incorporate it into the soil afterward. And there's lots of benefits. You get increased diversion. It's a great environmental education tool, both in the workplace, also at schools. People have a real tangible way to practice recycling every day. And for some businesses and some residential programs, you can save money overall depending on how you set up the programs. And there's lots of county assistance available. Like I said, anything from helping set up the programs to providing posters, helping find haulers, etc. I'd be glad to help with any of that. And I think that's the last slide.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll hold, and then we'll go out at once. Well, I'm impressed there's so many people here at 7:30. I'm Kathleen Schuler, and I work for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is a nonprofit in South Minneapolis. And what I work on mostly is the Healthy Legacy Coalition, and it's a coalition of 33 groups throughout the state trying to make safer products. Now, we heard about the waste stream, we heard about composting. So if there's a pizza box that has PFC chemicals that are used as a liner, that actually gets composted and goes into the soil. So what we want to do is prevent those toxic chemicals from getting in the products so that the county doesn't have to worry about the waste, so that the consumer doesn't have to worry about taking their hazardous waste somewhere, because we're reducing the level of hazardous waste. So what Healthy Legacy is about is safe products made safely. So we're trying to get some of those toxic chemicals that are in our consumer products out of the consumer products. And the basic problem is that the chemicals in our environment, the chemicals that are used in everyday consumer products, are not properly regulated. Has anybody heard of the Toxic Substances Control Act? TSCA. It's the federal law that regulates industrial chemicals. And believe it or not, there are 82,000 chemicals that are used in commerce right now. I mean, not all of them are used in large quantities, but they're out there, and they are not, a lot of them are not safe. Simply because the federal law that regulates chemicals that was enacted in 1976 grandfathered in 60 chemicals, or not 60, but 60,000 chemicals were grandfathered in without testing required. And then 20,000 have been added. So the problem is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the agency responsible for implementing TSCA, does not have the authority that they need to properly regulate chemicals. You know about asbestos. We know that it's a carcinogen. It causes mesothelioma. The EPA tried for 10 years to regulate asbestos. What they did is they promulgated these regulations for 10 years. They went through the whole process, and then the court overturned their regulation of asbestos, saying that they didn't have the authority, that they didn't consider the economic benefits of switching to an alternative. So it's only regulated 5 chemicals in the 34-year history. It's only required testing on 200 chemicals. So companies that are making these chemicals are not required to prove that they're safe before they go into consumer products, and the EPA doesn't have proper authority to require testing afterwards. So what we're working on is we want to reform that federal law so that we are protected, and we also want to work at the state level. So what we've been doing in Minnesota is our Public Health Coalition has broad membership. We partner with Clean Water Action because they do grassroots advocacy. We have the State Public Health Association. We have the Minnesota Council of Churches. We have the Learning Disability Association, Environmental Justice Advocates of Minnesota. It's just a broad array of groups that really care about public health. And people don't think about toxic chemicals as being a public health problem, but it is, because it's sort of this insidious exposure to these toxic chemicals from consumer products, and then from communities who live in areas where, you know, there are plants where these chemicals are made and used, workers that work in the plants. And then we've got the disposal issue, because some of these chemicals don't go away. They get into the soil, they get into our water, and they get into our air. So at the state level, what we've been trying to do is we've been doing like single chemical regulation. We regulated some toxic flame retardants. We helped pass a bill to ban mercury in the remaining products that mercury was in. So, for example, you can't sell a mercury mercury-containing thermostat in Minnesota anymore. So, and then in 2009, has anybody heard about bisphenol A? And bisphenol A is in what kind of plastic?
That the chemicals been banned in all the toys and stuff?
Yeah, well, it's in polycarbonate plastic. So the Nalgene bottles used to be made out of polycarbonate, and a lot of baby bottles used to be made out of it. And the problem is bisphenol A is a hormone-disrupting chemical, and we have a lot of animal studies to show that it does disrupt the hormone system. It causes reproductive harm, it causes developmental harm, and it's even linked to cancer. And we were putting it in baby bottles, so it leaches out when it's heated, and what happens with a baby bottle is you put more formula in, or you sterilize the baby bottle, and so you expose the child unnecessarily to a chemical that could potentially harm their development in the future. It might not show up when they're little, but it might show up later on in the form of a cancer or another kind of developmental problem. So we were the first state to ban bisphenol A in baby bottles and sippy cups. And that was in 2009. And now there's 7 states that have banned it, and a couple of countries. Canada actually was the first country. We're also working on the Toxic Free Kids Act, and the Toxic Free Kids Act would regulate chemicals in children's products. So we've got a federal law that bans lead in children's products, and also phthalates, which are additives to plastic toys like rubber duckies, and those are hormone disruptors as well. So when a child chews on a rubber ducky or another toy that has the phthalates, they're ingesting that hormone disrupting chemical. So we've got these states that are working on regulation, but what we really want to do is move to passing reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act. And we actually have a bill that's been introduced now in both the Senate and the House in Congress. And I've got some information on the back table about a nationwide coalition called Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families that's working on TSCA reform. And we don't want to just tinker with it. We really want fundamental reform, because we know this law is not working for us. And we've got a platform that what we'd like to see in the bills. So we've got a Senate bill that's Senator Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey is the chief sponsor. In the House, it's Representative Bobby Rush from Illinois and Henry Waxman from California. And the House bill right now is quite strong. It would fundamentally reform TSCA. It would switch the burden of proof from the EPA to the companies. So the companies would have to provide basic safety data on all of their chemicals, and they would have to assure that they were safe before being introduced into commerce. There's also a provision for hotspots to address environmental justice, so that communities that already have base exposures that are very high because they have arsenic in the soil, they have high levels of air pollution, and they have industrial sites and Superfund sites in their communities, they would be addressed specifically by EPA. They would designate some hotspots and try to reduce exposures in those communities. So it's a very good bill. We're working to help pass that and make sure that it's strong and it doesn't get watered down. You know what it's like in Washington, D.C. right now. It's really hard to pass anything strong. So what we're working on at the state level this session is the Toxic Free Kids Act. We passed the first part of it in 2009. And what it does is it requires the health department to generate a list of chemicals of high concern. And they've already generated a list of 1,756 chemicals. So these are chemicals that are high production volume, that are generated over 1 million pounds per year, which is about 3,000 chemicals. Ones that are persistent, meaning that once they get into the environment, they stay there for a long time, like PCBs. I don't know if you've heard of PCBs, and dioxins and mercury. They're bioaccumulative, that build up in the food system that we find in our fish and meat and dairy products and so forth, and also build up in our own body and get into breast milk. Or that are toxic. We know that they cause reproductive harm. We know that they affect the brain, or they can cause cancer. So those are the types of chemicals that are on this list, that they're then going to generate a smaller list of priority chemicals that are in children's products, and that's going to happen in February. So what we want to do with the bill that we're proposing this session is take the next step, and the next step is actually regulating those chemicals. So requiring companies that have priority chemicals, say there's 100 chemicals on the list, they would have to disclose if they used it in a children's product, and then the Pollution Control Agency would have the authority to actually regulate those chemicals. So that's kind of on the policy side. I also wanted to talk about what consumers can do. We can't solve the problem, and we can work for safer laws, we can work for state regulation, we can work for federal regulation, but we can also make some decisions, healthier decisions, buying safer products and so forth. So I've got a couple handouts on the back table. A Healthy Legacy handout, what we're about. A handout about the federal coalition that's working on TSCA reform. A guide to safer children's products. So if you have young children or grandchildren and you're looking for safer plastic products, this is available online on our website. Healthy lawn care. Last year we tried to pass a bill requiring green cleaning in schools and buildings. So that's one thing that people can do is make your own cleaners. So we've got a recipe for Alice's Wonder Spray. Or buy 7th generation. Buy the products that are safer, that don't have these toxic surfactants in them, that aren't going to pollute the environment. And also we're not going to expose ourselves as well. And then lawn care. So with lawn care is, we have a lot of lakes in Minnesota. We have a lot of water bodies. And when we put chemicals in our lawns, they end up in the stormwater runoff, and they end up in our lakes. And it's really not necessary. We can have a nice lawn without using toxic chemicals. And this is just a little handout with tips of how to not use those chemicals.